An aggressive biker hit an elderly black woman in a diner, unaware that boxing legend Mike Tyson was nearby. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The diner stood like a relic of the past, perched on the edge of a busy highway, its neon signs flickering in defiance of time. It was a slice of Americana, where truckers stopped for strong coffee. Families took breaks during long road trips, and locals came to savor the nostalgia of a simpler era. The interior matched the exterior's charm: red leather booths with metal trim, polished chrome accents, and a jukebox in the corner softly playing tunes from decades past. The smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee filled the air, blending seamlessly with the comforting clatter of dishes and the hum of quiet conversations. Behind the counter, a waitress with tired eyes and a warm smile was wiping down a stack of coffee cups. She exchanged friendly banter with a trucker nursing a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. In a corner booth, a family with 2 young kids were laughing over a shared milkshake, while at another table 3 teenagers were glued to their phones, occasionally snickering at something on their screens. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet yet vibrant in its way. Mildred's Diner, as it was known, was a place where people came to pause. But for some, like Miss Ruth, it was more than just a stop along the way. It was a small haven. Miss Ruth stepped into the diner, her slight frame draped in a brightly patterned cardigan. She adjusted her hat and smiled at the waitress, who greeted her with a cheerful, "Afternoon, ma'am. The usual spot?" Miss Ruth nodded and made her way to a booth by the window. She was a dignified woman in her 70s, her presence quiet but commanding in its grace. Her brown leather purse hung neatly from her shoulder, and she held herself with the poise of someone who had lived a life full of challenges, but faced each with courage. Today, she was returning from a weekend visit to her grandchildren. It had been a joyful trip, though the long bus ride home had left her feeling a little tired. Settling into the booth, she placed her purse carefully beside her and took a menu from the holder. She didn't need it, of course. Her order was always the same: a cup of Earl Grey tea and a slice of peach pie. As she waited, she gazed out the window at the endless ribbon of highway stretching toward the horizon. A deep sense of contentment filled her. This stop at Mildred's was a comforting tradition on her travels. In the corner of the diner, unnoticed by most, sat a man who carried his own kind of presence. Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, was hunched over his table, wearing a gray tracksuit with the hood pulled up over his head. His back was turned to the rest of the room, and he chewed thoughtfully on a hamburger, enjoying the rare moment of solitude. For him, places like this diner offered a refuge from the constant buzz of the outside world. Here, he could sit in peace, reliving memories of simpler times before the fame, the fights, and the chaos that followed. Mike wasn't oblivious to the people around him. He had always been a keen observer, and his instincts told him this was a safe place. A small, self-contained world where nothing extraordinary was likely to happen. But his sharp eyes couldn't help noticing the quiet confidence of the older woman by the window. There was something familiar in her bearing, something that reminded him of his mother and the strength she had carried in her posture even when the world tried to break her. The afternoon carried on, filled with the soft murmur of voices and the clinking of dishes. The waitress returned to Miss Ruth with her tea and pie, placing them on the table with a smile. "Enjoy, ma'am." "Thank you, dear," Ruth said, her voice warm and gentle. She took a sip of her tea, savoring its familiar taste, and allowed herself to relax. She didn't notice the door to the diner swing open with a sharp jingle of the bell. It wasn't immediately obvious that anything had changed. The 4 men who entered were dressed like any other bikers you might see on the road: leather jackets adorned with patches, heavy boots that thudded against the floor, and expressions that bordered on arrogance. They laughed loudly as they made their way to a booth in the center of the room, their presence commanding attention without them saying a word. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, scanned the room with an air of ownership. His name was Roy, and he walked like he owned every space he entered. Behind him, his companions followed, their movements less confident but equally menacing. As the bikers settled into their seats, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. Conversations grew quieter, and the waitress hesitated before approaching their table. The family, with the kids, exchanged uneasy glances, while the teenagers lowered their phones, suddenly alert to the change in energy. Miss Ruth, absorbed in her tea, barely noticed the new arrivals at first. But as Roy's loud voice filled the diner, she couldn't help but glance their way. Her gaze was met with a sneering smile. "Hey, look at that," Roy said, his voice cutting through the room. "We've got ourselves a queen over there by the window." His words drew laughter from his friends, the kind that made everyone else in the room uncomfortable. Miss Ruth kept her composure, her eyes returning to her tea as if she hadn't heard him. Mike Tyson, still in his corner booth, lifted his head slightly. His instincts, honed over years of survival both in and out of the ring, told him this wasn't going to end well. He didn't move yet. He simply observed, his expression unreadable under the shadow of his hood. Roy leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms across the back of the booth. "What's the matter, Grandma? Too good to look at me?" He smirked, but his eyes held a darker intent. Miss Ruth didn't respond. Her hands remained steady as she lifted her teacup, taking a slow sip. It wasn't her first time dealing with men like Roy, and she knew better than to give him the reaction he wanted. The tension in the diner thickened, and the hum of conversation all but disappeared. Everyone was watching now, though most tried to appear as if they weren't. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping a tray as she debated whether or not to intervene. Roy wasn't used to being ignored. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, louder this time. When she still didn't respond, he slammed his hand down on the table, making the dishes rattle. The sound echoed through the diner, drawing startled gasps from a few patrons. Miss Ruth finally looked up, her expression calm but firm. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "I don't believe we've been introduced, young man. If you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my tea in peace." Roy's companions chuckled, but there was an edge to their laughter now, a nervous energy as they glanced between Roy and the woman who refused to be intimidated. Mike Tyson's hands rested on the edge of his table, his knuckles whitening as he watched the scene unfold. He wasn't sure yet if he would need to step in, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Roy leaned forward, his smile returning but colder now. "You've got some nerve, lady. Don't you know who you're talking to?" Miss Ruth met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. Someone who thinks making a scene will make him feel important." The room seemed to hold its breath. Mike's eyes narrowed as he gauged Roy's reaction. The man's face darkened, and his hand twitched as if ready to reach for something. Whether it was another insult or something more physical, Mike wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. The bell above the diner's door jingled, the sound cutting through the quiet hum of conversation. 4 men strode in, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. They moved like they owned the place, exuding a mix of arrogance and aggression. The leader of the group, Roy, stood out immediately. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek and an air of self-proclaimed authority. His leather jacket bore the emblem of a motorcycle club, its patches worn and faded, but still visible enough to signal their allegiance. Behind him trailed three companions, each slightly less intimidating but equally menacing in their demeanor. They scanned the room as if sizing up every patron. The chatter in the diner dipped to a murmur, and the clatter of plates and utensils seemed to grow louder in the sudden lull. A family at one of the booths instinctively pulled their kids closer, while the waitress froze in place, her tray balancing precariously on one hand. Roy headed straight for a booth near the center of the diner, gesturing for his friends to follow. "Well, ain't this cozy?" he said, his voice loud enough to make everyone look up. "Smells like grease and desperation in here." His laugh echoed harshly as he slumped into the seat, sprawling his arms across the backrest like a king surveying his domain. The bikers didn't order right away. Instead, they lounged in their booth, talking and laughing among themselves, their voices carrying over the muted conversations of the other patrons. Occasionally, Roy would glance around the diner, his gaze sharp and invasive. He wasn't just looking, he was hunting for a target. Miss Ruth noticed them, of course. It was impossible not to. She sipped her tea and kept her focus on the view outside the window, but she couldn't ignore the change in the atmosphere. The diner, once warm and inviting, now felt tense and unwelcoming. She wasn't afraid. Years of enduring far worse had given her a quiet strength, but she didn't like the way Roy's eyes lingered on her table. Mike Tyson, still seated in his corner booth, also noticed. He didn't turn his head, didn't make any sudden movements, but he was watching them in his peripheral vision. His instincts, sharpened over years of dealing with danger both in and out of the ring, told him these men weren't here for a peaceful meal. He continued to eat his burger, slow and deliberate, while his mind worked through scenarios. Roy's voice suddenly cut through the room. "Hey, boys, check this out," he said, pointing toward Miss Ruth's booth. "We got ourselves a queen over there. What's the occasion, Grandma? Tea party?" His laugh was loud, harsh, and echoed by his companions. Miss Ruth didn't flinch. She set her teacup down gently, her hands steady despite the growing tension. She didn't look at Roy, didn't acknowledge his words. She had encountered bullies like him before, loud, crude men who thrived on intimidation, and she knew the best defense was often silence. But Roy wasn't the type to let silence go unanswered. He nudged one of his friends, a wiry man with a crooked grin. "What do you think? Should we join her? Maybe she'll teach us some manners." The friend chuckled, but his laugh was more subdued. There was a nervous energy to the group now, as if even they sensed the unease they were creating. Roy stood and took a step toward Miss Ruth's booth. The other patrons froze, their eyes darting between Roy and the older woman. The waitress took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, unsure of what to do. No one dared to intervene. "Excuse me," Roy said, leaning against the edge of Miss Ruth's table. His voice was mockingly polite, but the malice was unmistakable. "You look a little out of place here, lady. This is more of a beer and burger joint, not a tea room." Miss Ruth finally looked up at him, her expression calm but firm. "I wasn't aware this establishment catered only to a specific clientele," she said, her voice steady. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to finish my tea in peace." Roy's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. "You got some nerve, talking to me like that." Across the room, Mike Tyson's eyes narrowed. He could feel the shift in Roy's posture, the way his tone edged toward something darker. Mike wasn't the type to jump into every conflict, but he knew this was heading somewhere bad. Roy leaned closer to Miss Ruth, his presence looming. "You think you're better than me, huh? Sitting there all high and mighty? Let me tell you something, Grandma." "Hey, Roy," one of his friends interrupted, his voice uneasy. "Maybe we should just sit down. The food's probably coming soon." Roy shot him a glare. "Shut up. I'm just having a little fun." Miss Ruth didn't look away. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. "I've dealt with men like you my whole life," she said quietly, "and I'm still here. That should tell you something." The room seemed to hold its breath. Roy's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he straightened, his face hardening. "You're real funny, lady. Let's see how funny you are when—" "Enough." The word was spoken quietly, but it cut through the room like a thunderclap. Roy turned, startled, as Mike Tyson rose from his booth. The former heavyweight champion moved slowly, deliberately, each step toward the center of the diner drawing every pair of eyes. Roy blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sight of the man approaching him. There was something about Mike. His size, his demeanor, the quiet intensity in his eyes, that made even Roy hesitate. "Who the hell are you?" Roy said, his bravado returning as he straightened his shoulders. "You got a problem?" Mike stopped a few feet away, his hands relaxed at his sides. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. "Leave her alone." The silence in the diner was absolute. Even Roy's friends were frozen, their eyes darting between their leader and the man who now stood before him. Roy laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "What are you, her bodyguard? Look, old man, why don't you sit back down and mind your—" "I said, leave her alone." Mike's tone didn't change, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. For the first time, Roy seemed to notice the way the man carried himself, the controlled power in his stance. And for the first time, Roy hesitated. The room seemed to teeter on the edge of something dangerous, the tension thick enough to choke. Every eye was on Mike and Roy, waiting to see who would make the next move. Roy stood frozen for a moment, his bravado wavering as he locked eyes with the man standing before him. Mike Tyson wasn't just any man. Even under the gray hood of his tracksuit, his presence was commanding. He radiated a calm, controlled power that made the air in the diner feel heavier. The room was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. Roy's hesitation didn't go unnoticed. One of his companions, the wiry man with the crooked grin, nudged him nervously. "Roy, maybe we should just sit down," he muttered under his breath. "It's not worth it." But Roy wasn't one to back down, especially not in front of an audience. His pride flared, and he shook off the moment of doubt. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice rising as he stepped closer to Mike. "You think you can just walk over here and tell me what to do?" Mike didn't move, didn't flinch. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but his body was coiled like a spring, ready to react if necessary. His gaze was steady, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just a guy telling you to stop bothering her, that's all." Roy laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed through the diner. "Oh, you're just a guy, huh? Well, let me tell you something, pal. You don't tell me what to do. Nobody does." He jabbed a finger toward Mike's chest, but he didn't make contact. Something about the way Mike stood, the quiet confidence, the unshakable composure, made even Roy hesitate to cross that line. The tension in the room was suffocating. The waitress, who had been frozen behind the counter, now edged closer, her face pale. "Sir," she said, her voice shaking, "please, let's not make this into a scene." Roy ignored her. He leaned closer to Mike, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. You think you're some kind of tough guy, hiding under that hood, acting all cool? Let me tell you something. Roy, another one of his friends interrupted, his voice tight with fear. You need to stop. Look at him. But Roy was too far gone, his pride and ego blinding him to the warning in his friend's voice. He shoved his finger toward Mike again, this time brushing against his chest. What are you gonna do, tough guy? You think you scare me? Mike's expression didn't change. His voice, still calm, cut through the room like a blade. Last chance, walk away. Roy's laugh was cut short as he stepped back, his bravado faltering. But then, with a sudden burst of anger, he lashed out. His hand shot forward in a clumsy attempt to shove Mike back, the kind of move designed more to provoke than to hurt. It was a mistake. In a blur of motion, Mike shifted his weight and sidestepped the shove. His hand shot out with precision, grabbing Roy's wrist and twisting it just enough to immobilize him without causing serious harm. Roy let out a yelp of surprise and pain as Mike released him, sending him stumbling back a few steps. Don't, Mike said, his voice low and commanding. You're not ready for this. Roy's face turned red with humiliation and rage. He clenched his fists, his eyes darting to his companions as if looking for support. You think you're tough? He spat, his voice trembling with anger. Let's see how tough you are. Before anyone could react, Roy swung his fist in a wide arc, aiming for Mike's face. The move was telegraphed, sloppy, the kind of punch that relied on brute strength rather than skill. Mike didn't even blink. He ducked effortlessly under the swing and stepped in close, his body moving with the grace and precision of a predator. The counterpunch came fast, a short, controlled jab to Roy's midsection. It wasn't meant to cause serious damage, but it was enough to knock the wind out of him. Roy doubled over, gasping for air, his hands clutching his stomach as he staggered back. The diner erupted into chaos. Roy's friends jumped to their feet, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, charged at Mike with a wild swing. Mike sidestepped easily, his movements fluid and precise, and delivered a quick, measured punch to the man's shoulder, sending him spinning off balance and crashing into a nearby table. Another man, smaller and faster, tried to come at Mike from the side. But Mike's instincts were razor sharp. He turned just in time to catch the man's wrist, twisting it into a hold that forced him to his knees. With a firm push, Mike sent him sprawling to the floor where he stayed, groaning in pain. The last of Roy's companions, the wiry man with the crooked grin, hesitated. He looked at his fallen friends, then at Mike, and decided he wanted no part of this. He raised his hands in surrender and stepped back, his eyes wide with fear. Roy, still gasping for breath, tried to straighten up. His face was a mix of anger and humiliation. You don't know who you're messing with," he wheezed. "You're gonna regret this." Mike took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Roy's. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unshakable confidence. "You're the one who's going to regret it if you don't walk away." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Roy hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, with a muttered curse, he turned and staggered toward the door. His companions scrambled to follow, one of them still clutching his shoulder in pain. As the door slammed shut behind them, the diner fell silent. The patrons, who had been holding their breath, finally exhaled. The waitress leaned against the counter, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. Miss Ruth, who had watched the entire scene with quiet composure, finally spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Mike turned to her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me," he said simply. "Nobody should have to deal with that." He reached down to pick up her purse, which had fallen to the floor in the commotion. Handing it back to her, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she took the purse. "I'll be fine, thanks to you." The room remained quiet as everyone processed what had just happened. Slowly, the waitress stepped forward, her voice shaky but sincere. "Can I get you something? On the house, for both of you?" Mike shook his head. "Just make sure she's taken care of," he said, nodding toward Miss Ruth. As the tension in the diner began to fade, the patrons exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude. The quiet man in the corner booth had turned out to be something far more than he seemed. But for Mike, it wasn't about making a statement or earning praise. It was about doing the right thing, and that was enough. The tension in the diner slowly dissipated after the bikers stormed out, but the atmosphere was far from calm. People began whispering in hushed tones, casting sidelong glances at Mike Tyson as he stood near Miss Ruth's table. For most, it was the first time they'd seen such an intense confrontation up close, let alone one involving someone as recognizable as Mike Tyson. Yet Mike seemed unfazed by the attention. His focus remained entirely on Miss Ruth, who sat quietly in her booth, her hands resting on her lap as she tried to steady herself. "Let's get you checked out," Mike said, his voice calm but firm. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his movements gentle and deliberate. "That guy shoved you pretty hard. You sure you're okay?" Miss Ruth nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice as steady as she could manage. "It's not the first time I've dealt with people like that." Mike studied her face for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the faint bruise forming on her wrist where Roy had grabbed her. "You shouldn't have to deal with people like that," he said simply. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet conviction that carried more weight than any shouted words could. The waitress, still visibly shaken, approached cautiously. "Is there anything I can do for you, ma'am? Or for you, sir?" Her eyes darted nervously toward Mike, who shook his head. "She could use some ice," Mike said, nodding toward Miss Ruth. "And maybe a cup of fresh tea." The waitress nodded quickly and hurried back behind the counter, eager to do something that felt useful. The other patrons began to relax, turning their attention back to their meals, though many continued to steal glances at Mike and Miss Ruth. As the waitress returned with a small bag of ice and a fresh teapot, Mike helped Miss Ruth place the ice gently on her wrist. She winced slightly, but offered him a grateful smile. "You're very kind," she said, "but I have to ask, why did you step in? Most people would have just stayed in their seats and hoped it would blow over." Mike hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the window. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, as though weighing how much of himself he wanted to reveal. Finally, he said, "I grew up around people like Roy, bullies who think they can push everyone around just because they're bigger or louder. I've been on both sides of that, and I know how it feels to be the one nobody stands up for. I couldn't just sit there and let it happen." Miss Ruth tilted her head, studying him. "You've been on both sides?" Mike nodded, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't always the guy who stood up for people. There were times in my life when I was the one causing the pain. It took me a long time to figure out who I wanted to be." Miss Ruth didn't press him further, sensing that he'd already shared more than he intended. Instead, she simply said, Well, I'm glad you decided to be the man you are today. Mike offered her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Me too. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a police siren in the distance. A moment later, a patrol car pulled into the diner's parking lot, its lights flashing. The officers stepped out, their faces stern as they approached the building. The waitress visibly tensed, and a few patrons exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't every day the police showed up at Mildred's diner. The two officers entered the diner, their presence immediately commanding attention. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, scanned the room before his eyes landed on Mike. There was a flicker of recognition in his expression, but he quickly shifted his focus to the waitress. "Ma'am," he said, "we got a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what happened?" The waitress nodded quickly, explaining the events in a shaky voice. She described how the bikers had come in, how Roy had harassed Miss Ruth, and how Mike had intervened. As she spoke, the older officer glanced at Mike again, his brow furrowing slightly. When the waitress finished, the officer turned to Miss Ruth. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Miss Ruth shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a little shaken." The officer nodded, then looked at Mike. "And you're Mike Tyson, aren't you?" Mike gave a slight nod. "Yeah, that's me." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. "We've got witnesses saying you got into a physical altercation with one of the bikers. Is that true?" Mike's expression didn't change. "I stepped in when he started harassing her," he said, gesturing toward Miss Ruth. "He pushed her, and I made sure he didn't do anything worse, that's all." The officer studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll need to take statements from everyone," he said. "But based on what we've heard so far, it sounds like you were just trying to help." "Exactly," the waitress said, stepping forward. "He didn't do anything wrong. Those bikers were out of control." The officer raised a hand to calm her. "We'll sort everything out. Just sit tight." As the officers began taking statements from the other patrons, Mike and Miss Ruth sat quietly at the booth. She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You didn't have to get involved," she said after a moment. "You could have stayed out of it and let them handle it." Mike shrugged. "Maybe. But then what? He keeps pushing you around, maybe hurts you worse, and everyone just sits here and watches? I couldn't do that." Miss Ruth smiled faintly. "Well, I'm glad you couldn't." The officers finished their interviews and returned to Mike and Miss Ruth's table. "We've got enough to go on," the older officer said. "We'll be looking for those bikers. If they come back, call us immediately." Mike nodded. "Will do." The officer hesitated again, then extended a hand. "Thank you for stepping in. It's not every day you see someone willing to do the right thing." Mike shook his hand, his grip firm but not aggressive, just doing what needed to be done. As the officers left, the diner slowly began to return to normal. The waitress brought Miss Ruth a second pot of tea, and Mike sat back in his seat, his hood pulled low once again. The moment of tension had passed, but the quiet respect in the room lingered. For Miss Ruth, it was a reminder that there were still good people in the world, willing to stand up for what was right. For Mike, it was a small victory, proof that he could use his strength to protect rather than harm. And for everyone else in the diner, it was a story they wouldn't soon forget. The afternoon sun slanted through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the floor as the tension slowly ebbed from the air. Customers returned to their meals, though many still cast furtive glances at Mike Tyson and Miss Ruth. The recent confrontation had left its mark, but there was a strange calm now, a shared understanding among everyone present that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Mike remained seated across from Miss Ruth, his broad frame relaxed but still exuding an air of quiet vigilance. She sipped her tea, the slight tremble in her hands the only outward sign of her earlier ordeal. The bruise on her wrist had darkened, a stark reminder of Roy's aggression. Mike's gaze flicked to her wrist every so often, his jaw tightening each time. The door swung open abruptly, and all heads turned, expecting the return of the bikers. Instead, it was two more police officers, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. Following closely behind them was a tall, broad man in plain clothes. His badge glinted at his hip, and his commanding presence suggested a higher rank. As he stepped into the diner, his sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the quiet tension that still lingered. "Afternoon, folks," the man said, his voice calm but firm. He introduced himself as Detective Harris and nodded toward the officers. "We're here to follow up on the incident reported earlier. Looks like things got heated." The waitress approached nervously, wiping her hands on her apron. "It was those bikers," she said, her voice trembling. "They came in, started causing trouble, and one of them attacked her." She gestured toward Miss Ruth. "If it weren't for him," she pointed to Mike, "it could have been a lot worse." Detective Harris turned his attention to Mike, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Tyson," he said, his tone level, "it's not every day we get a call about you." Mike didn't flinch under the scrutiny. "I stepped in because she needed help," he said plainly. "That's all." Harris raised an eyebrow. "You're saying it was self-defense?" Mike nodded. "The guy was out of line. Pushed her, grabbed her. I stopped him." Miss Ruth looked up, her voice steady despite her earlier distress. "He's telling the truth. Those men came in looking for trouble. Mr. Tyson only acted when they wouldn't leave me alone." Harris nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the room. "We've been hearing similar things from the other witnesses." He gestured to the officers. "We're collecting statements from everyone, so if any of you haven't spoken to my team yet, now's the time." The waitress stepped forward again, eager to back up Miss Ruth's account. Other patrons began chiming in, recounting the events with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The tension began to ease as Harris listened carefully, nodding at key details. When the detective turned back to Mike, his expression softened slightly. "Seems like you did the right thing, but those bikers are a problem. They've been causing trouble up and down this stretch of highway for months now. Harassment, intimidation, even a few assaults. We've been trying to catch them in the act." "Well, you've got plenty of witnesses now," Mike said. "What's stopping you?" Harris sighed. "Unfortunately, it's not that simple. They'll claim it was all a misunderstanding, maybe even try to twist the story and say they were provoked. Without physical evidence or a clear video of what happened, it's their word against yours. And bikers like that, they stick together." Mike's expression darkened. "So they get away with it?" "Not this time," Harris said firmly. "We've got enough to charge them with assault, and we're not letting it slide. But they've got lawyers who know how to play the system. It's going to take more than just this incident to put a real dent in their operations." As Harris spoke, the door swung open again, and a young officer entered, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a phone. "Sir," the officer said, approaching Harris. "This was found outside, probably dropped by one of the suspects during the scuffle." Harris took the bag and inspected the phone, his brow furrowing. "If we're lucky, this might have something useful," he said, then looked at Mike and Miss Ruth. "If you're both willing, we'd like you to file official complaints. It'll strengthen the case." "I'll do it," Miss Ruth said immediately. Her voice carried a note of defiance that made Mike glance at her with admiration. She wasn't a woman who backed down easily. Mike nodded as well. "If it helps, count me in." Harris smiled faintly. "Good. We'll take care of the paperwork." While the officers continued their work, Mike turned his attention back to Miss Ruth. "You've got guts, you know that?" he said with a small smile. She chuckled softly. "You're one to talk. What you did back there, it wasn't just brave, it was necessary. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Mike shrugged, his gaze drifting out the window. "I just did what anyone should have done." "Maybe," she said, "but not everyone would have." Their conversation was interrupted when Detective Harris approached again. "We're wrapping up here, but I need to warn you both. These guys don't like being crossed. If they know you were involved in getting them arrested, they might try to retaliate." Mike's eyes hardened. "Let them try." Harris nodded, as if he'd expected nothing less. "Still, be careful, both of you. And if you see them again, call us immediately." Miss Ruth glanced at Mike, then back at Harris. "Thank you, Detective. I'll be careful." As the officers left, taking the evidence and statements with them, the diner finally began to return to normal. The waitress approached Miss Ruth with a fresh cup of tea and a slice of peach pie on the house this time. "You deserve this," she said with a smile. Miss Ruth thanked her and took a bite, savoring the sweetness. "This place may have its troubles," she said, glancing at Mike, "but there's still good here." Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said, "there is." The two of them sat in companionable silence for a while, the diner's hum of life resuming around them. For Miss Ruth, it was a reminder that even in moments of adversity, there were people willing to stand up for what was right. For Mike, it was another step in his journey, a chance to use his strength not for fame or fortune, but for something that truly mattered. And for everyone else in the diner, it was a story they'd carry with them, a moment when they witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature, and saw the latter triumph. The golden glow of the setting sun spilled across the diner's parking lot as Mike Tyson and Miss Ruth stepped outside. The warm hues of orange and pink stretched across the horizon, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the small establishment only hours earlier. The hum of passing cars on the highway provided a soothing backdrop as the two walked together toward Miss Ruth's car. Mike kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, his towering frame emanating quiet vigilance. Despite the calm exterior, his mind was racing. He thought about what Detective Harris had said, that the bikers might not let this go. It wasn't fear that bothered him. It was the thought that Miss Ruth could be in harm's way. "I can drive myself home, you know," Miss Ruth said with a small smile, sensing his protective nature. Mike shook his head. "I'd rather see you get there safely," he replied. "After the day you've had, you shouldn't be alone." Miss Ruth gave him a knowing look. "I've been alone before, Mr. Tyson. It doesn't scare me, but I do appreciate your company." She unlocked her car, a modest sedan that spoke of practicality and a life lived without excess. Mike held the door open for her as she climbed in. Before shutting the door, he leaned down slightly. "Do you have family nearby? Someone who can check on you?" "My son and daughter-in-law live a couple of towns over," she said, "and my grandchildren are always a phone call away." Her tone was reassuring, but there was a subtle hesitation in her voice. Mike caught it. "Call them," he said. "Let them know what happened. They need to know." Miss Ruth nodded, her expression softening. "I will." As she started the car, Mike stepped back and watched her drive off, the taillights fading into the distance. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, staring at the road. It wasn't until the sound of a passing car broke his reverie that he turned and began walking toward his own vehicle, parked on the far side of the lot. The evening air was cool, carrying with it the scent of the nearby pine trees. Mike took a deep breath, his mind replaying the events of the day. He hadn't expected to step into a situation like this when he stopped at the diner. All he'd wanted was a quiet meal and some time to himself. Instead, he'd found himself reminded of the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of man his mentors had tried to teach him to become. As he reached his car, an old, battered SUV pulled into the lot, parking haphazardly near the diner's entrance. For a moment, Mike tensed, his instincts on high alert, but as the doors opened, he saw that it wasn't the bikers returning. Instead, it was a young family, 2 parents and a child, stepping out and heading inside. Mike let out a small breath of relief and climbed into his car. Before starting the engine, he took a moment to sit in silence. The diner's lights glowed warmly in the rearview mirror, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to relax. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but he didn't turn the key. Instead, he stared out at the highway, the endless stretch of road that seemed to call to him. He thought about all the places he'd been, all the fights he'd won, and all the battles he'd fought outside the ring. Today felt different. It wasn't about glory or proving himself. It was about doing what was right, something his mother had always told him mattered more than anything else. The memory of her voice filled his mind, grounding him in a way few things could. As he finally started the car and pulled onto the highway, Mike's thoughts drifted to Miss Ruth. She had faced the bikers with a quiet strength that reminded him of his own mother. Despite her age and the challenges she'd faced, she hadn't let fear control her. She had stood tall, and that had inspired him to do the same. Meanwhile, back at her modest home, Miss Ruth settled into her favorite chair by the window. A cup of tea steamed on the side table, and her phone rested in her lap. She had already called her son to tell him what had happened, though she'd downplayed the more frightening parts. She didn't want him to worry. As she stared out at the quiet street, she reflected on the day. The fear, the anger, the humiliation, those emotions lingered, but they were overshadowed by something far more powerful. Gratitude. Gratitude for the strangers who had spoken up, for the police who had taken her seriously, and, most of all, for the man who had stepped in when it mattered most. She picked up her phone again, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number for her grandchildren. A smile crept across her face as she pressed call. When the youngest answered, her voice bright and full of energy, Miss Ruth felt her spirits lift. "Grandma, are you okay?" the child asked after hearing a brief version of the story. Miss Ruth chuckled softly. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. Today, I was reminded that there are still good people in the world." The story of what had happened at the diner spread quickly. The waitress shared it with her friends, the customers who had witnessed it told their families, and soon enough it became a local legend. People talked about the quiet strength of Miss Ruth and the unexpected heroism of Mike Tyson. For those who had been there, it was a moment that would stay with them, a reminder of what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. For Mike, the road ahead stretched endlessly, but he felt lighter somehow. The world could be a dark place, filled with cruelty and selfishness, but it could also be a place of kindness and courage. And as long as he could, he'd keep using his strength to tip the scales toward the latter. The highway hummed beneath his tires as the stars began to peek through the darkening sky. For now, he drove on, content in the knowledge that he'd done his part. The rest of the world would have to take care of itself, but if it couldn't, Mike Tyson would be ready. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and check out our other videos for more great content. See you in the next one.